Pound and Eliot on Ulysses, the critical tradition. It is part of the mythology of modernism that we habitually discuss Ulysses and the Wasteland as if they were simultaneous artistic performances, twin children of the zeitgeist. In our desire to make those annae mirabilis of the early 1920s even more miraculous, we suppress the obvious fact that The Wasteland and its attendant masterpieces, such as Pound's Hugh Selwyn Mobley, were written with Joyce's great novel clearly in view. During the years 1918 to 20, when the first half of Ulysses was appearing serially in the Little Review and the Egoist, Joyce's novel exercised a growing influence as its monumental dimensions became apparent. Few works can have received such intense publicity or impressed themselves so deeply upon the literary consciousness, while still works in progress. Ulysses was a cultic object and cultural artifact long before its book publication by Shakespeare and Company in 1922. Recent studies in the literary history of the period have refined our sense of Ulysses as a work in progress and have provided new evidence of its profound impact upon the literary development of Pound and Eliot in particular. Robert Adams Day has demonstrated that from early 1917 onward, Eliot was as ardent and well-informed a Joyce partisan as Pound or Harriet Weaver, and that he as well as Pound was seeing the episodes of Ulysses as soon as Joyce sent them to London. This means that both Pound and Eliot would have been familiar with the novel as far as Propertius by mid-1918 and as far as Sirens by mid-1919. The early episodes, from Nestor to Wandering Rocks, would have been specially impressed upon Eliot's mind since he read them with the care of a proofreader while assistant editor of The Egoist. But beyond this early knowledge of the episodes published in serial form, Day makes a strong case that by the fall and winter of 1921, when The Wasteland was written and revised, Eliot and Pound knew all of Ulysses except possibly Ithaca and Penelope. In the light of this close involvement with Ulysses as a work in progress, many of the poetic accomplishments of Eliot and Pound in the period 1918 to 22 take on a Joycean cast. Eliot's use of myth and the mock heroic in Poems 1920, Pound's imaginary conversation with Propertius in the Homage, the Odyssean frame for Hugh Selwyn Mobley, the ritual background and much of the specific imagery in The Wasteland, the key role of Homer and the epic in the recasting of the early cantos. All these aspects of the poetic achievements of Pound and Eliot, and many more, can be related to the overwhelming example of Joyce's work in progress. Less attention, however, has been given to the impact of Ulysses on the development of Pound and Eliot as critics, although the years 1917 to 22 were crucial for both of them. It was in these years that Pound's critical ideas were brought to maturity and shaped into the pedagogical schema which later appeared in How to Read, an ABC of reading. It was in these years that Eliot evolved the critical assumptions which underlie his most influential essays and wrote all of the pieces in The Sacred Wood and Homage to John Dryden. It is no exaggeration to say that Pound and Eliot wrote their most important criticism under the shadow of Ulysses, and partly in response to Joyce's unsettling masterpiece as it gradually took shape before their eyes. Although the presence of Ulysses can be felt in almost all their criticism of 1917 to 22, this paper is focused specifically on those essays and comments where Pound and Eliot are grappling directly with Ulysses. I hope such a focus will not only reveal some of the basic attitudes of the two most important poet critics of their age, but will give a perspective on the long critical tradition that they initiated, and in large part defined. The critical tradition devoted to an understanding of Ulysses, which often seems nothing but an extended conversation between Pound and Eliot. From Pound's first contact with Joyce in late 1913, when he chose I Hear an Army for the Des Imagistes anthology because of its objective qualities, the term realism dominated all of his formal comments on Joyce's work. In fact, Pound's 10-year effort to assimilate Joyce's achievement, from Dubliners through Ulysses, may be seen as a gradual definition of that realism which he hoped to capture from the prose tradition and make his own. Looking back on the decade from the perspective of 1933, when his immediate enthusiasm for Joyce's work had been somewhat cooled by Finnegan's Wake, Pound still acknowledged Joyce as the first English writer to follow Henry James in extending the art of the novel beyond the territory already occupied by the French. Building upon Ibsen and Flaubert, Joyce produced in Dubliners and Portrait a clean, hard surface where English prose catches up with Flaubert, and then proceeded to break new ground in Ulysses. Speaking of his first enthusiastic response to Dubliners, Pound linked it, as always, with his own poetic aims. As Madox Ford had been preaching the virtues of the French prose, of what he called Impressionist prose, for some years, and as the Imagist First Manifesto had demanded direct treatment of the thing, whether subjective or objective, and the use of no word that did not contribute to the presentation, a few people recognized the significance of Joyce's first prose book at once. Pound encountered Dubliners at the time when he was developing one of the crucial discriminations in what was to become his abiding view of the usable tradition, the notion that with Stendhal and Flaubert the major artistic impulse went over to prose, and that the job of the modern poet was to assimilate the discoveries of the prose tradition. Writing to Harriet Monroe in January 1915, with Dubliners and Portrait in the foreground of his mind, Pound identified the qualities which he most admired in the prose tradition. Poetry must be as well written as prose. Its language must be a fine language, departing in no way from speech save by a heightened intensity, i.e. simplicity. There must be no book words, no periphrases, no inversions. It must be as simple as de Maupassant's best prose and as hard as Stendhal's. Language is made out of concrete things. General expressions in non-concrete terms are a laziness. They are talk, not art, not creation. First and last, it was the precision and realism of Joyce's language that Pound praised and hoped to imitate. He had already been groping toward a concept of poetic realism in his essays on the French poets Francis Jammes and Charles Vildrac, who, along with D.H. Lawrence, are evoked in his 1914 review of Dubliners as examples of poets who have written short narratives in verse, trying, it would seem, to present situations as clearly as prose writers have done, yet more briefly. Throughout the review of Dubliners, Pound is trying to sort out his views of realism, distinguishing the exact presentation of the Stendhal-Flaubert tradition from the softer effects of Impressionist prose, and the entire essay subtly tilts the axis of Joyce's achievement toward Pound's current artistic preoccupations. The symbolic dimensions of Dubliners, the covert thrust toward allegory, the effective uses of symbolist prose, these are slighted in an effort to establish Joyce as a realist who writes a clear, hard prose. But even the focus on realism is not as precise as it appears to be on first reading. As in all of Pound's subsequent comments on Joyce, there is a not quite successful attempt to square Joyce's scrupulous attention to realistic detail with his ability to disengage the universal element through selection and concentration. Mr. Joyce does not present types, but individuals. He is classic in that he deals with normal things and with normal people. Here is the nub of Pound's critical problem. He wishes to found Joyce's universal appeal on his objectivity, his mastery of concrete detail, without denying his powers over general nature. The various ambiguities inherent in the term realism inhabit all of Pound's criticism of Joyce between 1914 and 1922, and are never fully resolved. At times, realism means simply defying the censor, whether political or Freudian, opening up new areas of human experience for serious art. In this sense, the Joyce of Ulysses was the ideal modern Rabelais, whom Pound had imagined in a limerick of circa 1912. Sweet Christ from hell, spew up some Rabelais, to belch and to define today, in fitting fashion, and her monument. Heap up to her in fadeless excrement. In Ulysses, Joyce lanced the boil of a sick culture, using gross realism as his scalpel. But by realism, Pound also meant the Jamesian surface that he aimed at in Mobley, a delicate record of contemporary manners made with objective irony, that history of contemporary ethics in action, l'histoire morale contemporaine, which the Goncourt brothers had called for, that record of les mœurs de ses contemporains, leurs rêves, leur vanité, leur amour, et leur folie, which Remy de Gourmont had found in Flaubert. Pound used this quotation to head his 1917 review of Eliot's Prufrock and Other Observations. And he meant by realism a third thing, something more subtle, the use of luminous detail, which he was striving for in his poetry, an effort to locate the universal in the particular, to fulfill the Coleridgean aesthetic on a grand scale. At times, Pound's realism takes on the aspect of romantic symbolism and echoes Goethe's famous distinction between the symbol and mere allegory. There is a great difference, whether the poet seeks the particular for the general, or sees the general in the particular. From the first procedure arises allegory, where the particular serves only as an example of the general. The second procedure, however, is really the nature of poetry. It expresses something particular without thinking of the general or pointing to it. Such an emphasis on the particular explains, in part, Pound's resistance to the late elaborations of Ulysses. All these gradations of realism are present in Pound's continuing response to Joyce, but none of them allow sufficient scope for Joyce's love of allegory, his Celtic delight in artifice and design, what Pound called his medievalism. Therefore, Pound's complex notion of modern realism ultimately led to a special and somewhat limited view of Joyce's Ulysses. The challenge of Joyce and the prose tradition is clearly evident in the first draft of Canto 1, 1915-17, where Pound is uncertain whether the semi-dramatic, semi-epic techniques borrowed from Browning and his own earlier practice are up to a modern, long poem. Can they hold his vision, or will he have to sulk and leave the word to novelists? As Forrest has pointed out, Pound had not solved the problem of how to include novelistic realism and history in a modern literary work when he began to write the cantos, and this uncertainty is reflected in his 1916 notice of Exiles, Mr. James Joyce and the Modern Stage. This long and pessimistic survey of the modern stage, where Exiles cannot find an intelligent audience, ends with a question. Must our most intelligent writers do this sort of work in the novel, solely in the novel, or is it going to be, in our time, possible for them to do it in drama? If we read poetry for drama, then Pound is asking a personal question, which colours his entire response to Ulysses, and to Eliot's work as well. In reviewing Prufrock in 1917, Pound linked Eliot with Joyce, and singled out the novelistic qualities of the verse at the expense of the qualities which seem more obvious to a later reader. James Joyce has written the best novel of my decade, Portrait, and perhaps the best criticism of it has come from a Belgian who said, "All this is as true of my country as of Ireland." Eliot has a like ubiquity of application. Art does not avoid universals. It strikes at them all the harder in that it strikes through particulars. This last sentence, when said against the background of romantic symbolism and the foreground of imagism, the prose tradition and Pound's comments on the Chinese written character, gives one a clear sense of the higher realism that he sought in Ulysses. The value which he attached to this realism and its accompanying precision of language is expressed with great passion in his 1917 review of Portrait, written at the nadir of wartime despair. Flaubert pointed out that if France had studied his work, they might have been saved a good deal in 1870. If more people had read The Portrait and certain stories in Mr. Joyce's Dubliners, there might have been less recent trouble in Ireland. A clear diagnosis is never without its value. It is very important that there should be clear, unexaggerated, realistic literature. It is very important that there should be good prose. The hell of contemporary Europe is caused by the lack of representative government in Germany and by the non-existence of decent prose in the German language. Clear thought and sanity depend on clear prose. They cannot live apart. The former produces the latter conserves and transmits the former. Pound's first brief notice of Ulysses, written in 1918-19 after the opening chapters had passed across his desk, announces in staccato form the direction of all his subsequent comments. Joyce's place in the Flaubertian tradition is particularized. He has done what Flaubert set out to do in Bouvard and Pécuchet, done it better, more succinct. Anticipating the more elaborate analysis of the 1922 essay on James Joyce et Pécuchet, and Pound, tired of rewriting the arguments for the realist novel, simply quotes in conclusion the entire preface by the Goncourt brothers to the first edition of Germanie Lacerteau. A paragraph from this preface, which had become for Pound the master document of prose realism, had been used earlier in his meditations upon the difficulty of getting portrait printed in book form. Now that the novel is wider and deeper, now that it begins to be the serious, passionate, living, great form of literary study and of social research, now that it has become, by analysis and psychological inquiry, the history of contemporary ethics in action, how shall one render accurately the phrase, l'histoire morale contemporaine, now that the novel has imposed upon itself the studies and duties of science, one may again make a stand for its liberties and its privileges. As Ulysses grew to its final dimensions in the years 1919 to 21, and as Joyce's artistic aims departed more and more from those of the Flaubertian prose tradition, Pound's conception of the work scarcely altered. In effect, his later essays of 1922 to 3 are simply a working out of the view of Ulysses already established in 1918 to 19. There are several explanations for this, one of which has to do with the history of the text. Pound's first and lasting impression of Ulysses was based on the earlier and plainer versions of the first 9 episodes, before Joyce had revised them to harmonize with the more complex second half of the novel. Like Ivor Winters, who seems to be talking of the first published version of Stevens's Sunday Morning, even when he has the final text before him, Pound was conditioned by the Ulysses that he read in 1918 to 19. But these circumstances of publication cannot offer a full explanation, since Eliot read the first versions of the opening chapters in great detail, and still arrived at a quite different version of the finished work. More important are Pound's efforts at the time toward his own ideal of poetic realism. Languedoc, Muir, Contemporain, homage to Sextus Propertius, the early cantos, Hugh Selwyn Moberly, works which fixed certain qualities of Ulysses indelibly in his mind. As always, Pound was most interested in a literary work for what it could contribute to a live tradition, in this case the tradition of his own difficult poetic progress since 1912 to 13, and those aspects of the developing Ulysses which did not jibe with his view of the modern literary tradition were pushed aside. Thus, the Sirens episode, the first chapter to confront the reader with the inescapable implications of Joyce's schema, received a cool reception from Pound. Pound writes disapproving of the Sirens, Joyce told Frank Budgen in June 1919, then modifying his disapproval and protesting against the close and against obsession and wanting to know whether Bloom, prolonged cheers from all parts of the house, could not be relegated to the background and Stephen Telemachus brought forward. Joyce later remarked to Harriet Weaver that Pound's disapproval of Sirens is based on grounds which are not legitimate and is due chiefly to the varied interests of his admirable and energetic artistic life. Already Joyce must have realized that Pound's interest in Ulysses was inextricably bound up with his own critical theories and evolving artistic energies, and that the two men would inevitably diverge as Joyce's art ceased to match Pound's conception of what it should be. In view of this resistance to Joyce's later methods in Ulysses, it is not surprising that Pound's encomium of 1922, which begins, "All men should unite to give praise to Ulysses," merely echoes his earlier opinions. The critical points of the earlier notices are repeated and sometimes amplified, and although Pound displays a detailed knowledge of the work's conclusion, his remarks on the last episodes are curiously bland. The metamorphoses between past and present, which resemble those of the cantos, are often acknowledged. Molly is both Giatulus, the earth symbol, and a coarse-grained bitch, but the elaborate orders of the finished novel are of little interest to Pound, and even the Homeric frame is described as simple reversal. In this super novel, our author also has poached on the epic, and has, for the first time since 1321, resurrected the infernal figures. His furies are not stage figures. He has, by simple reversal, caught back the furies, his flagellant castle ladies, Telemachus, Circe, the rest of the Odyssean company, the noisy cave of Aeolus, gradually place themselves in the mind of the reader, rapidly or less rapidly, according as he is familiar or unfamiliar with Homer. These correspondences are part of Joyce's medievalism, and are chiefly his own affair, a scaffold, a means of construction, justified by the result, and justifiable by it only. The result is a triumph in form, in balance, in main schema, with continuous inweaving and arabesque. In the delicate exchange between myth and reality, which is one of the hallmarks of modernism, Pound, unlike Eliot, is firmly on the side of the present. Like the 1922 Dial Notice, Pound's essay on James Joyce et Pécuchet rehearses a familiar position. Taking advantage of the Flaubert centenary, Pound made his most elaborate assessment of Joyce's inheritance from Flaubert and the Goncourts. Ulysses takes up where Flaubert left off in Bouvard et Pécuchet, laying bare, through encyclopedic realism and satire, the inanities of the modern world. It is the realistic novel par excellence. Each character speaks in his own way and corresponds to an external reality. The symbolic and mythic frames are but means of regulating the form, necessary but mechanical controls on the realistic narrative. Joyce uses a scaffold taken from Homer and the remains of a medieval allegorical culture. It matters little. It is a question of cooking, which does not restrict the action, nor inconvenience it, nor harm the realism, nor the contemporaneity of the action. Once again, the inherent antagonism between allegory and the luminous detail is apparent. Whereas Eliot saw Ulysses as a continuous parallel between contemporaneity and antiquity, Pound viewed the novel's schema as an ordering device not organically related to the narrative, a vestigial medievalism which has little to do with the work's essential realism. Since Pound chose to reprint James Joyce et Pécuchet in Polite Essays, 1937, we may assume that he considered it his final statement on the unique place of Ulysses in the prose tradition. Forrest Reed claims that in 1922, when Pound saw Ulysses as a whole for the first time, he gained a new awareness of the prose tradition as a development from the epic tradition. Pound wrote several Paris letters for the Dial on Flaubert and Joyce. Of Flaubert he wrote, "More and more we come to consider Flaubert as the great tragic writer, not the vaunted and perfect stylist. I mean that he is the tragedian of democracy, of modernity." Both Flaubert and Joyce were a classic in that they represent every man, even while writing l'histoire morale contemporaine. Flaubert had adumbrated a new modern form in Bouvard. Joyce had perfected that form in Ulysses, and at the same time conflated the novel and the epic. It is true that Pound gained a new appreciation of the epic dimensions of Ulysses in 1921-22, and that he acknowledged the logic given to the novel by its mythological correspondences. But he was still more interested in Ulysses as an extension of Flaubert's encyclopedia in the form of farce. Ulysses is more unified than Bouvard et Pécuchet, although similar in intention. Joyce combines the Middle Ages, the classical eras, even Jewish antiquity, in a current action. Flaubert strings out the epochs. After all the evidence cited by Forrest Reed has been taken into account, the emotional balance in Pound's most comprehensive study of Ulysses remains firmly on the side of realism. Molly may be a reincarnation of Penelope, but Pound locates her reality in the language and behavior of contemporary life. In January of 1923, Pound published a little-known essay on criticism in general, which marks the dividing line between his early engagé criticism and his pedagogical essays of the 1920s and 1930s, where he is propagandizing a formed and static view of the tradition. Almost impenetrable when read in isolation, this essay provides a shorthand sketch of Pound's 10-year critical progress and is alive with resonances for the reader familiar with his entire critical oeuvre. addressed to a typical disciple, On Criticism in General is really a rough draft for the later How to Read and ABC of Reading. Here, for the first time, Pound summarizes all his scattered debts to his contemporaries, and outlines the figures from Homer to Joyce who have provided the essential inventions. Central to the entire historical argument is his conviction that Stendhal, with his remark about la poésie avec ses comparaisons obligées, marked the moment in time when the best minds turned to prose. In a schematic genealogy stretching from Flaubert through the Goncourts, Dostoevsky, and Henry James to Joyce, Pound outlines the main channel of recent literary energy, as distinct from the local history of the novel in England. In this genealogy of the period, Joyce stands alone among Pound's contemporaries, followed by the bold statement, Fenollosa on the Chinese ideograph. As Forrest has observed, Pound called On Criticism in General his De Vulgare Eloquio, because it provided the theoretical basis for his new work on the cantos, which would combine the organizational methods learned from Fenollosa's discoveries with his decision to begin his own poem as a modern Odyssey, in the wake of the prose Ulysses. But the essay also makes clear that Pound's use of Homer would be very different from that of Joyce, based on moments of metamorphosis rather than the great coordinating frames of Ulysses. Pound's special view of realism precluded his use or full appreciation of those qualities in Ulysses which Eliot was to identify as Joyce's major contributions to modern literature. T.S. Eliot's relationship to Joyce's work in progress was more cautious, and at the same time more ambiguous than that of Pound. Ulysses abrupted on the literary scene when Eliot's critical ideas were still malleable, and from the first he felt somewhat threatened by the overwhelming size of Joyce's achievement. Writing in The Egoist for June-July 1918, when he could hardly have read beyond the Propertius episode, Eliot spoke of Ulysses as volatile and heady, but terrifying, as any great new work of art must be. And even in his finely measured assessment, Ulysses, Order and Myth, 1923, he described Joyce's work as a book to which we are all indebted, and from which none of us can escape. It has given me all the surprise, delight, and terror that I can require. By mid-1918, Eliot had assimilated Pound's belief that Ulysses would finally upset the traditional view of prose as a humbler vehicle than poetry, although he seemed concerned that Joyce was operating within the medium of his own feelings and emotions, not tempering and purifying them, as Stendhal did. He was disturbed by the crudity and egotism which Joyce shared with Yeats and other Irish writers, while admitting that in Ulysses it was justified by exploitation to the point of greatness. Clearly, Eliot was troubled from the start by the threat which Joyce's diverse and rambunctious prose might pose to the classicist, and even in the London letter to the Dial, dated September 1921, written shortly before his main work on the Wasteland, he linked Ulysses with the performance of Stravinsky's Cercle du Printemps, where he had sensed a lack of interpenetration and metamorphosis between the primitive and the modern. The effect was like Ulysses with illustrations by the best contemporary illustrator. The spirit of the music was modern, and the spirit of the ballet was primitive ceremony. The vegetation rite, upon which the ballet is founded, remained, in spite of the music, a pageant of primitive culture. It was interesting to anyone who had read The Golden Bough and similar works, but hardly more than interesting. In art, there should be interpenetration and metamorphosis. In everything in the Cercle du Printemps, except in the music, one missed the sense of the present. Whether Stravinsky's music could be permanent or ephemeral, I do not know, but it did not seem to transform the rhythm of the steps into the scream of the motor horn, the rattle of machinery, the grind of wheels, the beating of iron and steel, the roar of the Underground Railway, and the other barbaric cries of modern life, and to transform these despairing noises into music. Yet, even when Eliot felt the unsettling terror and uncontrolled energy of Ulysses, he also felt its surprise and delight, and much of his theoretical criticism in the years 1918 to 21 may be read as covert responses to Joyce's amassing novel. Tradition in the individual talent is founded on certain perceptions which Pound had adumbrated in The Spirit of Romance, 1910, but it can also be viewed, along with the quatrain poems of Poems, 1920, as an attempt to handle Joyce's bold challenge of the conventional relationships between past and present. Like a devoted but somewhat timid child, Eliot was trying to process Joyce's novel into a congenial world of authority and tradition. The first breakthrough for him seems to have come during the writing of The Waste Land in 1921, when he must have discovered the full extent of his debt to Joyce. Ulysses had delivered to the modern artist a new and dynamic relationship between past and present, a usable attitude toward myth and history which, far more than Eliot's own poems 1920, fulfilled the theoretical precepts of tradition and the individual talent. When Ulysses appeared in February 1922, Joyce clearly anticipated a public appreciation from Eliot, and on April 10th he wrote to Harriet Weaver in disappointment. "I expected that at least the Dial would have arrived today with Mr. Eliot's article, but not even that has come." Eliot may have delayed his expected encomium because of the enthusiastic notice which Pound wrote for the June Dial, but it seems more likely that he held back because he had not yet come to terms with the novel, and was not yet prepared to make a definitive critical statement. In the Dial September issue, Eliot weakly echoed Pound when he referred to Ulysses as "at once the exposure and the burlesque of that of which it is the perfection. It is not a work which can be compared with any novel." This comment prepares the way for Ulysses, Order and Myth, where Eliot claims that the novel ended with Flaubert and with James, and that Joyce, after trying one novel in portrait, set himself a more expansive and problematic form in Ulysses. It seems obvious that the nature of Joyce's new form, and its particular manifestations, was still a cause of anxiety to Eliot in the period 1921 to 22. In his comments of those years, he tried out a number of Pound's rationales for the greatness of Ulysses, as in the Dial London letter of August 1921, where he praised Joyce's constructive ability. But it was only with the completion of the work and the publication of Valérie Labeau's Appreciation that Eliot found the key to his instinctive responses. Labeau's essay, an expansion of his talk given at the Paris Séance of 7 December 1921, was first published in the Nouvelle Revue Française for April 1922, and Eliot arranged to have an English translation printed in the first issue of the Criterion, October 1922, which also contained the text of The Waste Land. Written under Joyce's guidance, with the complete novel and Joyce's schema at hand, Labeau's introductory essay emphasized the symbolic dimensions of Ulysses and the Odyssean backdrop, thus providing Eliot with the classical sanctions that he needed. In Ulysses, Order and Myth, November 1923, Eliot makes no mention of Pound's 1922 essays and refers to Labeau as the only commentator who has appreciated the significance of Joyce's method, the parallel to the Odyssey, and the use of appropriate styles and symbols to each division. The center of Eliot's essay is a mock quarrel with Richard Aldington, who had pretended to find Ulysses deficient in discipline and classical order, and the famous concluding paragraphs of the essay announce in triumphant tones Eliot's newly discovered understanding of Joyce's classical method, an easy commerce between past and present, between tradition and the individual talent. Joyce's parallels with the Odyssey have the importance of a scientific discovery, because they enable the artist to impress both the pastness of the past and its eternal presentness. In Eliot's reading of Ulysses, Bloom is no more a Ulysses figure than Ulysses is a Bloom figure. The two levels of reality become one in a work which mediates between myth and contemporary manners, although from time to time the missionary spirit of Eliot's essay tilts the balance toward myth and archetype. In using the myth, in manipulating a continuous parallel between contemporaneity and antiquity, Mr. Joyce is pursuing a method which others must pursue after him. They will not be imitators, any more than the scientist who uses the discoveries of an Einstein in pursuing his own independent further investigations. It is simply a way of controlling, of ordering, of giving a shape and a significance to the immense panorama of futility and anarchy which is contemporary history. Instead of narrative method, we may now use the mythical method. It is, I seriously believe, a step toward making the modern world possible for art. In the history of Joyce criticism, Pound's essay on James Joyce et Pécuchet and Eliot's essay on Ulysses, Order and Myth have become touchstones to two important dimensions of the work. What Arnold Goldman has called the fact-myth ambiguity in Joyce's art is accurately reflected in the criticism of Ulysses. It has been said that the history of literary criticism can be described as a running debate between Plato and Aristotle. The history of Ulysses criticism can be viewed with equal justice as an extended conversation, often amiable, occasionally irritable, between the spiritual descendants of Pound and Eliot. In our own time, Hugh Kenner and Richard Ellman have been the most prominent inheritors, but virtually every study of Ulysses can be located on a continuum that stretches between Pound and Eliot. What this means, quite simply, is that the two most powerful literary sensibilities of the age responded in characteristic fashion to the two most powerful strains in Joyce's fiction. When asked to lecture on English literature at Trieste's Università Dopolare in 1912, Joyce chose as his subjects verismo and idealismo, Defoe and Blake, thus anticipating the poles between which Ulysses fluctuates. With the appearance of each new book on Ulysses, the call goes out from the reviewers for some ideal, balanced reading which will do justice to both extremes of Joyce's art. But that ideal criticism will never come. Ulysses itself is a meeting place and battleground for all the diverse strains in the history of prose fiction, not a work of easy reconciliation. And only the enormous learning and energy which Joyce put into the work holds the warring elements together. None of our reactions can match this complexity and this energy. Therefore, our criticism must constantly fluctuate between partial visions, between fact and myth, between Pound and Eliot. For instance, the 1960s witnessed a general trend toward more novelistic readings of Ulysses, and away from the headier symbolic readings of the 1950s. A trend set in motion by S.L. Goldberg's The Classical Temper. But in Richard Ellman's Ulysses on the Liffey, published in this anniversary year, Joyce's schema reasserts all of its most outrageous claims. Since any critical study is bound to be a partial record of one reader's imperfect understanding, we may expect future critics to reenact over and over again, with various degrees of intelligence and originality, the debate which Pound and Eliot initiated while Ulysses was still a work in progress. It is our good fortune, and Joyce's, that the terms of this long critical conversation were established by the two greatest poet critics of his time.